Hey guys. Tonight we'll be turning back the pages of a dark history to witness a period so lavish it borders on revolting, the horrifying final days of George IV. Just picture this: the opulent rooms of Windsor Castle glowing under candlelight, the air thick with the stench of rotting meat and opium smoke. And at the center of it all, the king himself, a bloated, exhausted figure clinging to a decaying throne with what little strength he has left. Trust me, this scene will send more than a few chills down your spine, and you might find yourself wondering, could I survive a dinner party with him? Spoiler, you wouldn't make it out alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment and let your imagination drift down the long, cold corridors of Windsor. You're standing right outside the private bedchamber of George IV, where he spent most of his final days. They say his belly alone became the subject of gossip across Britain. If you're curious about its size, picture an enormous armchair, and then imagine it growing two purplish legs swollen from gout. Right now, the candle flickers, and his shadow casts itself onto the wall like a creature, half man, half mountain. Do you hear the wheezing breath? It echoes like a saw through wood, and servants take turns standing guard in case he collapses at any moment. A historical fact you might want to remember: in his final phase, George IV ruled Britain almost entirely from his sickbed. Supreme power, but unable to bend down and tie his shoes. A lesser-known detail: George IV was obsessed with filling his bedroom with expensive Chinese porcelain. Some nights, he would demand dozens of blue-glazed jars be hauled in and placed around his bed to feel protected. Some whispered. The room looked more like a bargain warehouse, missing only a clearance sale sign above the headboard. You might think, being king must be wonderful. But in truth, historians still debate whether George IV suffered from severe depression or was simply a man hopelessly in love with his own misery. Some records say he often wept through the night, lamenting his lost youth and the meals he could no longer swallow. A bit tragic, a bit comedic, isn't it? If you've ever had a long, exhausting day, take comfort in this. At least you can still dress yourself. George IV couldn't. Each morning, it took 4 servants to lift him up and wipe him down with brandy-soaked cloths to mask the scent of decay spreading through his legs. Not exactly horrifying, just a bit pungent. Tonight, imagine yourself as a visitor. You walk across thick carpet, eyes rising to a massive portrait on the wall. George IV, in his youth. Smug smile, scepter in hand. It's a strange feeling, as if you're looking at 2 completely different people: a dashing prince and a rotting king, consumed by his own excess. A curious, even comical fact: George IV was infamous for his ridiculous fashion choices. Once, he wore a floor-length ermine-trimmed robe just to eat breakfast. So if you're listening to this in your pajamas, congratulations. You're dressed more appropriately than the King of England. Just a joke. Don't be mad. As for his meals, he could devour an entire royal feast in one sitting. A light evening for George IV included 3 pheasants, slices of braised veal, 4 types of sugar-glazed pastries, and strong liquor. After hearing that, your own appetite might seem quite modest. Doctors warned him many times, but he'd wave them off, saying, "Dinner is the only joy I have left." Historians still debate whether he drank to soothe loneliness or simply because he enjoyed being drunk. If you shift slightly in bed now, you might feel the blanket brushing your shoulder, the night air sneaking through the window crack. That's the perfect moment to let go of all tension and remind yourself that none of us have to live like George IV. You know, one night, a servant found him drifting into unconsciousness, clutching a small velvet pouch. Inside wasn't gold or jewels, but a lock of silver hair and a few old letters. They say it belonged to a woman he once loved but never married. That detail softens the story a little. Even though George IV was known to crave pleasure more than anything else, modern scholars believe his obsession with youth drove him to spend every ounce of wealth and energy trying to maintain his grandeur long after his body had betrayed him. Strange, isn't it? A king who once captivated London society, ultimately defeated by his own bloated stomach and relentless pain. If you're still awake, imagine this: a quiet night. Windsor Castle silent. Only the labored breathing and the ticking of a grandfather clock echoing in the room. You, an imaginary witness, sit beside that enormous bed, and right then, you'll see a truth that isn't so unfamiliar. Gold and glory eventually become just empty porcelain jars surrounding a man in decay. Still with me? If so, take a deep breath and let this story drift through you like a night breeze. Still listening? Then let's go further back in time. Out of that gloomy room, back to when George IV was just a child with sparkling eyes and an ego the size of a kingdom. You're standing in St. James's Palace. The year is 1762. The scene is nothing like the end. Light spills over silk-covered walls. The air smells of polished wood and lavender. In a luxurious cradle lies George Augustus Frederick, a boy destined to become the most infamous king of the Hanoverian line. You can picture his face as a child: soft, dark blonde hair, round rosy cheeks, looking so harmless that if someone had told you this boy would one day spend money with reckless abandon, you'd probably burst out laughing. An official fact worth noting: George was the eldest son of King George III, the monarch, who famously lost his mind, plunging the country into a state of uncertainty. In truth, it was his father's madness that gradually pushed George into the role of Prince Regent, and eventually the throne, by which time he was already accustomed to every privilege without any real responsibility. They say that from a young age, George was enamored with elaborate clothing, a strange but true detail. At just 17, he once wore a full crimson uniform decked with fake medals just to impress a girl he liked. Whether she fell for him or not is unknown, but surely she was surprised, or at least had to stifle a giggle. Historians still debate whether George's excessive indulgence as a child turned him into a vain and unruly man, or whether he was simply a product of an era where extravagance and showmanship were the norm. Some scholars insist he wasn't stupid, he just never had to grow up. Now imagine yourself walking the palace halls during George's teenage years. Thick Persian rugs swallow your footsteps. To harp music drifts from the drawing room, and the young prince is showing off his emerald ring collection. Occasionally, he pauses to caress the jewels as if they were real companions. Perhaps those were the rare moments he felt in control of anything at all. By the time George turned 20, he was already entangled in notorious love affairs. One of the biggest scandals was his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, which was strictly forbidden for an heir to the throne. If you're thinking, oh, they must have truly loved each other, here's a gentle reminder: partly true. But George was also known for being impulsive, often driven by liquor and lust. Did you know he wrote dozens of letters begging Maria to accept him, including one tear-streaked note in which he vowed to take his own life if she refused? One night, they found George collapsed on the floor, clutching a bottle of opium. It might have been theatrical, But Maria gave in. They married in secret, though the union was later declared invalid. Another odd fact: George took immense pride in his architectural and decorative achievements. He was the one who transformed Brighton Pavilion into a lavish Indian-style palace. With domes and intricately carved pillars, historians still argue whether he did it to assert his power or simply to escape responsibility while his father descended into madness. Picture this. Amid a national, political, and financial crisis, George casually hosted 3-day banquets. On a shimmering chandeliers, head done, a velvet cloak, diamond chains heavy on his chest, sipping fine wine. And yes, this was as the royal treasury continued to drain, thanks to the future king's personal tastes. If you're lying down listening to this now, you might feel a mix of curiosity and mild irritation on behalf of the tax-paying subjects. But let's be fair, most European royalty at the time were just as wasteful. George was merely exceptional at it. Just a little joke. If there were an award for fastest spender of the 18th century, he'd win gold. And finally, in 1820, after years as Prince Regent, George was officially crowned King George IV. But sadly, youth had long abandoned him. He ascended the throne in poor health, buried in debt, and carrying a reputation far from glorious. You might wonder, did being excessively spoiled from the cradle rob him of the chance to become a better ruler? Perhaps George IV, too, was lonely in his own castle, haunted by a dazzling past, and terrified of the moment when it would all fade. If you're still awake, exhale gently, release your shoulders, and let your imagination drift along the fading footsteps down those crimson halls. And don't worry, this story is far from over. You shift slightly, the soft blanket brushing your shoulder, as the story continues to unfold, the fragmented portrait of George Weir's life, both resplendent and sorrowful. After the coronation in 1821, it seemed that George had finally reached the pinnacle of power he had long craved. But paradoxically, the throne became a heavy cage, trapping him in solitude and illness. Imagine yourself quietly trailing behind the royal entourage, passing through the marble columns of Westminster Abbey, as the king, draped in gold-embroidered robes, walks with labored steps amidst the blare of trumpets and countless watchful eyes. An official event worth remembering. George IV's coronation is said to be the most extravagant in British history, costing over a staggering sum at the time. Nobles and commoners alike were dazzled by multi-day feasts, rivers of wine, and lanterns adorning towering halls. You might envision it like a grand theatrical performance, where he was the proud star, yet the only one unaware the final act was drawing near. A lesser-known fact: George IV was so obsessed that he commissioned a brand new throne for himself, encrusted with hundreds of gemstones. Just placing it on the coronation dais required nearly 20 servants. If that sounds absurd to you, rest assured you're not alone in thinking so. Historians still debate whether that coronation was a final moment of glory or merely a desperate display to mask a rotting body and weary mind. Some claim George was drunk throughout the ceremony. Others argue he was fully sober, just too exhausted to muster another smile. Picture this. After the ceremony, as the candles begin to die out, he returns to his private room and sheds the heavy, gilded robe. Beneath the dazzling velvet lies a withering man, his body swollen with disease, and eyes once radiant, now dull as dusty glass. One night, when the doctor visited, George sipped Madeira and complained that he felt nothing but pain. Think about that, what irony. That the man who once gorged on every earthly pleasure could, in the end, taste only bitterness. If your eyelids are heavy now, don't sleep just yet. Here's a small anecdote. George IV feared being forgotten. Once, he told his secretary, "I shall be remembered as either the greatest or the worst king, nothing in between." And in truth, he was right, though history leans heavily toward the latter. Just a light jest, if there were a title for King of Terrible Decisions. George would surely earn at least 3 medals. Take a slow breath and let your thoughts drift to his final years. As he aged, George grew paranoid. He suspected even his personal doctors, convinced they were plotting to poison him in favor of his brother, the Duke of Clarence. Later, William IV. Servants recalled nights when he'd sit muttering in the dark for hours, gripping the hilt of an old sword beside his bed. One often overlooked detail: George IV was deeply superstitious. He believed dreams foretold fate. A legend says that months before his death, he dreamt of walking into a dark room filled with whispers, only to see his own aged face smirking back at him. Historians still argue, was it just opium and wine? Or was he truly haunted by guilt and loneliness? Try shifting your body slightly, letting your shoulders relax. And imagine a summer morning in 1830. Sunlight filters through heavy velvet curtains, casting its glow on a face disfigured by illness. George Quath lies motionless, breathing shallowly, his eyes open but lifeless. A strange moment, when all the grandeur of the Hanoverian dynasty narrows down to the faint, faltering beat of a dying heart. You remember his famous declaration, "I shall never leave this world quietly." And yet, on that morning, death arrived without fanfare. No trumpets, no crown placed upon silvered hair, only the scent of melting wax and the muffled sobs of a few loyal servants. If you're still listening, perhaps you now see, George IV was both pitiable and blameworthy. A man who chased pleasure, power, admiration, and ended up with only solitude and the fear of being forgotten. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders fall. And remember, you're hearing these stories in a world far more peaceful than the one he knew. You tilt your head gently on the pillow, listening to your own steady breath. As the story curves into a new chapter, the women who passed through George IV's life. If you ever believed royal love stories were romantic ballads, prepare yourself. George IV is living proof that a powerful heart can sometimes be nothing more than a machine hungry for selfish gratification. Picture a young prince, blonde hair, blue eyes, impeccably dressed, and most important, armed with a bottomless purse. As Prince of Wales, George quickly became the most infamous playboy in London. People said he had more mistresses than days in the year. But among all those hedonistic affairs, 2 women left deeper marks than the Restone secret marriage. One legal union, and not a single happy ending. An official event worth remembering. In 1785, at just 23, George secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a beautiful Catholic widow, far gentler than the libertine women he usually pursued. The marriage was illegal under the Act of Settlement, since she wasn't Anglican, but George didn't care. He was intoxicated by what he called the greatest love of my life. A strange, little-known detail. The night he proposed to Maria, George faked a suicide by mixing opium and brandy, then collapsed dramatically on the floor. She panicked, thinking he was dead, until he cracked an eye open and whispered, "If you refuse me, I have no reason to live." She accepted. If that sounds theatrical, it was. He was the king of tragicomedy. Historians still debate. Did George truly love Maria Fitzherbert? Or was he simply obsessed with the thrill of a forbidden romance? Some argue his passionate letters prove he was sincere, Others suggest he loved the idea of doomed love more than the woman herself. Close your eyes and imagine the dim room where they exchanged their vows in secret. A tiny silver cross tucked in a coat pocket. A hidden agreement never to be officially acknowledged. For the rest of his life, George spoke of her with a voice that blurred pride and regret. Then, as if fate were mocking him, George was forced to marry another woman to erase his crushing debts. It was a lawful, public union, but cold to the point of cruelty. In 1795, he married Caroline of Brunswick, a distant cousin from Germany. If you're hoping for a royal love story, my condolences. This marriage is remembered as one of the most notorious unions in British royal history. Caroline was no shrinking violet. She was bold, outspoken, with a biting wit George detested from the very first meeting. A little-known fact: on their wedding night, George got so drunk he passed out by the fireplace, leaving his new bride alone in their bed. Can you imagine a lonelier beginning? Historians still argue over the cause of their collapse. Was it Caroline's appearance and forthrightness that repelled George? Or was he simply still pining for Maria Fitzherbert? One historian noted that only 3 days after the wedding, George was already bitterly regretting it. Picture them living in Carlton House, two strangers avoiding each other in endless, echoing corridors, communicating only through letters despite being under the same roof. One child was born Princess Charlotte, fragile flame in a frozen marriage. But even her presence couldn't bridge the distance. Months after childbirth, Caroline moved out. George openly flaunted new mistresses. If you're wondering, did he ever feel remorse? The answer, rarely. George once said he considered his marriage to Caroline a series of torments. Even after he became king, he tried everything to bar her from his coronation, a move that enraged the public. A gentle jest. If there were an Oscar for worst husband role, George IV would have taken home the golden statue. Now curl your legs slightly, loosen your back, and take in the irony. A man who had power and riches beyond measure, yet never managed to hold a decent marriage. When Caroline died in 1821, just weeks after being barred from the coronation, it's said that George sighed with relief. But there are also accounts claiming that, in the silence of night, he would still whisper, her Namia breath tinged with remorse and the same old pride. You take a slow breath, letting the warmth of the blanket settle over your shoulders. As the story begins to shimmer in your mind, the absurd, almost surreal opulence of George IV. Imagine yourself quietly following the royal entourage through the grand hall of the Brighton Pavilion, the strangest seaside palace in England, where he indulged in pleasure for years. Onion-shaped domes like Indian temples, dragon-carved columns, gold-gilded walls glistening under oil lamps. One contemporary guest wrote that entering the pavilion felt like stepping into the chaotic dream of someone too rich and too bored. Amps, an official event worth noting. The Brighton Pavilion began as a modest seaside villa, but George transformed it into a palace more expensive than many official castles. Decoration alone cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, a colossal amount in the 19th century. He ordered enormous chandeliers, some weighing several tons, to hang above diners' heads as a silent reminder. This is my domain. If you had ever sat in the main dining room, you would have seen a scene bordering on the ridiculous, a nearly 30-meter-long table covered in Chinese porcelain, engraved silver plates, crystal goblets, imported fresh flowers, and countless intricate dishes. George IV was known to love three-course feasts, an hours-long affair with overflowing wine and whipped cream covered desserts. It's said he once devoured 7 pastries in one night, then still had room for steak, smothered in spicy sauce. A little-known detail: George had an enormous scent cabinet filled with rare perfumes, used to mask the stench of illness clinging to his body. Every morning he sprayed so much that the hallways remained fragrant all day, leaving guests both impressed and bewildered. Historians still debate. Was it mere vanity, or a desperate attempt to conceal his inner decay? Picture this. Under golden lamplight, he wears a floor-length velvet robe, diamond rings, the size of grapes, glinting on his fingers, walking slowly down Turkish carpeted corridors. Every night, he summoned harpists and violinists to lull him to sleep even as storms howled outside. They say George IV collected everything, from Italian master oil paintings and Ming Dynasty vases to gilded French clocks. Some objects he bought simply because they were rumored to be rare, regardless of whether he understood their value. In his private bedroom, he piled up jewelry boxes and even placed a red velvet-covered throne in the corner to reflect on his divine mission. If you're lying there listening, you might chuckle softly. It sounds more like a boy who never grew up than the king of an empire. One detail rarely mentioned: George once hired an entire team of French chefs to craft dishes worthy of making angels salivate. It's said he spent nearly £500 a week on food and drink, alone an astronomical amount for the time. To put it in perspective, many noble families didn't spend that much in an entire year. Historians continue to debate whether such relentless extravagance was his way of compensating for a deep fear of being forgotten, or simply the result of a childhood spent in constant indulgence. One scholar wrote that George IV seemed to believe every gilded chair was a shield for his dignity. Try closing your eyes now, listening to the echo of royal heels tapping against marble floors, and imagine watching him seated in the pavilion drawing room, surrounded by cautious aristocrats, musicians playing minuets, candlelight dancing across his swollen face. And yet, amidst all the grandeur, there was something faintly ridiculous. George IV was never truly satisfied. He always craved one more gem, one more banquet, one more cheer. But like an endless hunger, the indulgence only drained him faster. One late night, after the guests had left, a servant found him sitting silently among his newly purchased porcelain, eyes vacant. In that moment, the room's glow seemed to vanish, revealing the emptiness closing in. Perhaps he realized all the splendor was nothing more than a garish play, powerless against the quiet loneliness within. If you're still awake, let out a quiet laugh. Isn't it true that sometimes we, too, gather useless things just to feel a bit safer? A gentle joke. If George IV lived today, he'd definitely be a VIP customer at every major shopping mall. You take a deep breath, letting your awareness settle into a strange stillness where the red velvet walls of the Brighton Pavilion begin to blur, giving way to a starkly opposite image: the narrow, dim streets where thousands of English citizens crowded into flimsy shacks. Picture a foggy morning along the banks of the Thames. Beneath the stone bridges, children shiver as they carry baskets of coal scraps to sell. Their faces are smudged with soot, their clothes patched and threadbare, while George IV sips fine wine from a crystal goblet on a velvet chair. There are families surviving on moldy bread and cold water. An official fact you should know: during George's time as Prince Regent and later as King, Britain suffered severe economic crises. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, soaring food prices, and mass unemployment crippled the country. While the court spent thousands on banquets, tens of thousands of citizens faced hunger and freezing nights. A strange but telling detail: at one point, the cost of a single ball gown George commissioned was enough to support a modest working-class family for 20 years. A satirical newspaper of the time illustrated him with a bulging belly, holding a chicken leg, while emaciated beggars knelt beneath him, an image both comical and bitter. Historians still debate George IV's role in this suffering. Some say he was merely a product of an extravagant, soaked dynasty. Others argue his impulsive, selfish nature helped erode public trust in the monarchy. Close your eyes and picture the contrast. On one side, candlelight glinting off diamond rings in the pavilion. On the other, a flickering oil lamp over a London slum, where a young mother clutches her coughing child against the cold. It's said that whenever George hosted lavish feasts, carts of leftover food were hauled to the city's edge. The poor would scramble for stale bread, vegetable peels, burnt scraps of meat, while servants brushed off their hands with a sigh. The ragged lot are swarming again. You may feel a peculiar emptiness now, a chasm between king and people that no gold could bridge. One lived in a palace fit for fairy tales. The other fought for every crumb, every penny. On a winter night in 1816, wind swept through Charing Cross, whirling snow around the feet of hunched match sellers. Meanwhile, George toasted his birthday in the Brighton Pavilion's grand hall. Everyone wore imported fur robes. Tables groaned under roast goose, gustarpies, and sweet Madeira wine. Perhaps that very night, some did not survive the cold. If you're still listening, ask yourself, did he care? Or did he view poverty as mere background noise around his palace walls? Historians still debate. Did George IV ever truly pity another human being? Or had his heart grown numb beneath the weight of wine? Fame and pleasure? A gentle joke. If social media had existed back then, George would have been cancelled daily. Take a slow breath and let the images sharpen. Newspaper boys dragging their feet through slush. Crippled old men extending frail hands, and far off, the pavilion's dome gleaming like a glittering wound. A lesser-known fact, despite harsh public criticism, George maintained his lavish lifestyle until the very end. In his will, he left behind hundreds of treasures, but not a single meaningful sum to charity. Even sick and near death, he ordered more wine and perfume, as if terrified of the moment he'd face the empty silence. Shift slightly under your blanket, letting it wrap around your shoulders. And remind yourself, people often say wealth is a blessing, but when it isolates you from the world, it becomes a curse. Tonight, you're luckier than George IV. You are being heard, understood, and free in your own quiet room. And you don't need walls of gold to feel that you matter. Take another slow breath, and let that final image fade like lamplight smoke. A jeweled king on his throne, looking down at his starving subjects, yet never truly seeing them. If you're still awake, loosen your shoulders. The story is far from over. After the dazzling nights of revelry in Brighton Pavilion, dawn would rise over the poor districts, with cold seeping through every cracked brick. Imagine a bleak morning, the sky ashen like a mourning shroud, and the wool workers of Lancashire trudging silently toward the mills. They were the invisible pillars holding up the kingdom people George IV seldom mentioned, except to complain about the sooty masses ruining the scenery during his hunts, an official event to remember. The years George served as Prince Regent and later King coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which hurled millions into the unforgiving gears of modern labor. Children as young as 7 or 8 worked 14-hour days, hauling coal on their backs, fingers blistered from spinning thread. Meanwhile, in London, their king lounged in a velvet chair, spraying perfume and grumbling that dessert wasn't sweet enough, a strange but seldom recalled detail. George IV once commissioned a golden carriage with a domed roof engraved with unicorns soothed only for a few laps around the park. That sum could have built dozens of shelters for the homeless. Historians still debate. Was it deliberate vanity? Or was he simply unaware that behind every gleaming coin lay the sweat and sorrow of thousands? Place yourself for a moment on a corner in Spitalfields, where immigrant weavers huddle in damp attic rooms. At night, they heard rumors of royal balsandless banquet tables and nobles wagering more than an entire neighborhood's worth of wealth. In the haze of hunger and cold, someone surely asked, "Why was I born? If others have everything just for wearing a crown." If you're still listening and still awake, you might feel a chill not from the cold, but from the injustice that never seems far from human history. On a winter evening, wind rushes through the alleys, snuffing out the last oil lamp. Meanwhile, at Brighton Pavilion, George IV reclines on a chaise longue, plump fingers curled around a wine glass, his head resting on a gold-embroidered pillow. Records say he liked having a servant read out a list of his possessions before bed, a ritual that comforted him, like a child soothed by being told he is loved. Ask yourself, in such a chasm of wealth and want, how could people still believe in divine right or sacred monarchy? That blend of arrogance and apathy sowed the seeds of doubt. Poets and journalists began writing tragedies and satire, portraying him as a giant dung beetle perched atop treasure, eyes shut to the misery surrounding him. Historians still argue, was George IV truly blind? Or did he simply choose to turn away to avoid responsibility? Some say he was drowning in guilt and illness, too dulled to see the harm he caused. Others insist he was so enamored with the role of the luxurious king that he deceived even himself into believing it was destiny. You shift your shoulder, feel the blanket brush your skin, and wonder, how often have humans justified extravagance with the words, "It's fate"? One little-known fact, even when illness left him unable to walk, George IV continued ordering more porcelain and rare wood chairs to adorn his bedroom in proper style. Visitors recoiled at the sight of a darkened room, reeking of opium and sickness, stuffed with hundreds of extravagant objects. Close your eyes and picture yourself walking through two parallel worlds. One, endless parties under crystal chandeliers. The other, leaky rooftops dripping rain onto straw beds where a weaver's family tries to sleep. That distance isn't measured in miles, but in indifference. If you're still awake, take a slow breath and let the image of Brighton Pavilion's domes and the city's slums fade like morning mist on broken tiles. Because tonight's story isn't just about grandeur or poverty, it must now lead you quietly across another threshold, the threshold of power. And then, when the candles sputter out, wine glasses empty, and the parties fall silent, what remains is a greater question. How did George IV actually rule Britain? Beneath that glittering crown, law, politics, and even lives were swayed by the will of one man driven by a thirst to be loved and a ceaseless urge to prove himself. You adjust your position. Let your shoulders relax, and imagine yourself standing at the edge of a great map of the British Empire in 1820. It was a time brimming with upheaval. Napoleonic wars just ended. The economy drained, workers enraged, and political reform bubbling beneath the surface. An official fact to remember, during nearly a decade as Prince Regent, from 1811, and continuing as king, from 1820, George upheld a rigidly conservative regime. His government was led by Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, man who fiercely opposed electoral reform, cracked down on democratic movements, and curtailed freedom of the press. If you listen closely, you might hear the boots of British soldiers striking stone floors as they marched to suppress protests, demanding lower taxes and better living conditions. A little-known detail. In 1819, under the guise of maintaining order, troops opened fire on a peaceful crowd in St. Wonners, Peter's Field, Manchester causing the infamous Peterloo massacre, where hundreds were wounded or killed. When the grim news reached London, George IV, then still the Prince Regent, showed no sign of sympathy. He supported the harsh measures and declared it a necessary act to extinguish the seeds of rebellion. Historians still debate. Did he truly believe he was defending the nation? Or was he simply terrified of losing the lavish lifestyle sustained by the wealthy aristocracy? Try closing your eyes and picturing a late night, when stacks of petitions piled up on the desks of government officials, while George partied into the early hours. In the dim glow of candlelight, he raised a glass of Madeira and muttered a line that servants would later record: "Let the hungry fend for themselves." A seldom mentioned fact. Under George's reign, the government enacted the Six-Axa series of repressive laws designed to silence the press and limit public assembly. Any pamphlet critical of the monarchy could be labeled incitement to riot. Historians continue to argue over the long-term effects, but most agree the laws pushed Britain into a simmering atmosphere of tension and resentment for years to come. Imagine stepping into a cramped London tavern, where a group of printers pass around a handwritten newspaper full of misspellings. Every word is a fragment of courageous, quiet rebellion, in a time when speaking the truth could lead to prison. If you're still awake, perhaps you've begun to sense the bitterness. George IV embodied both extravagance and a deep fear of having his power questioned. He spent freely without remorse, yet issued laws banning anyone from criticizing the crown. One night near the end of his life, weakened by illness and forgetfulness, George IV asked his servant to read aloud the list of laws he had signed. Records say he mumbled a few unintelligible phrases, then fell silent. In that moment, the throne, the statutes, and the gilded chandeliers of the pavilion were reduced to hollow echoes around a man in decline. Take a deep, slow breath, letting your mind drift from that harsh scene gently toward the story's final arc, because tonight, as you close your eyes, what lingers may not be the cruelty of legal codes, but a simple truth. Power without compassion is nothing more than an empty shell. You adjust the blanket on your shoulder as your imagination slowly glides through a divided Britain victorious over Napoleon, yet fractured within. In the grand Anglican cathedrals, prayers rise for peace, but outside, millions of Catholics live under discrimination, forbidden from holding office, attending universities, or becoming members of parliament. An official event to remember. For nearly 3 decades, Parliament fiercely debated Catholic emancipation. Many politicians, including the Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, supported easing the restrictions. But George IV, while outwardly appearing tolerant, vehemently opposed it. A little-known fact: George had sworn an oath to his father, King George III, promising never to grant Catholics such liberties. That promise became both a burden and a political weapon. Historians still dispute whether he resisted out of genuine belief or a fear of losing support from the conservative elite. Now, close your eyes and imagine the House of Commons in 1829. The air so thick you could almost touch the tension. Pro-emancipation, MPs shouted impassioned arguments. The opposition slammed their fists on desks in outrage. Outside, citizens gathered to pray, clutching wooden crosses, eyes ablaze with the desperate hope of finally being treated as equals. Meanwhile, George IV sat in St. James's Palace, clutching his chest from a surge of heart pain, instructing his secretary to declare he was too sickened and weary to hear any more of the matter. A bitter detail: the very poor he scorned were often devout Catholics, people who prayed weekly for the prosperity of the royal family. You shift slightly. And ask yourself, what could be more ironic than a king who lived in shameless luxury preaching about the purity of faith to deny others their right to equality? A gentle yes. If George XII ever wrote an autobiography, the chapter on religion would probably be titled, "I don't care, but I still forbid it." In the end, the political and social pressure was too great. In 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed, allowing Catholics to hold civil office and sit in Parliament. But George IV signed the document with a scowl, described as looking like he'd just bitten into a lemon. Historians still debate. Was this decision a triumph of progressive reason, or merely a reluctant concession from a monarchy whose prestige had run dry? You exhale softly. Picturing the moment, thousands of Catholic faithful knelt in Westminster Square, eyes glistening with tears upon hearing they were finally recognized as full citizens. Meanwhile, George IV lay bedridden, wheezing with rage and fear, a little-known fact. Though he resisted emancipation to the bitter end, George still requested his private doctor, read him the Bible each night as if to soothe his gnawing fear of divine reckoning. It said that on many nights, he trembled and muttered that he would be judged for the suffering he had caused. Picture yourself in the corner of the House of Commons, its thick oak walls and fogged glass windows enclosing an air steeped in ink and cigar smoke. The sound of debate never stops in national debt, electoral reform, workers' rights. Outside, throngs of poor citizens remain buried in labor, unaware that a single signature in this room could change their lives. An official fact to recall. When George IV ascended the throne in 1820, Britain was just emerging from the shockwaves of the Napoleonic era. Over 2 decades of war had left a colossal debt. Taxes soared, especially the Corn Laws, which drove bread prices to punishing heights, fueling mass discontent. But instead of easing the pressure, the court and its conservative government chose suppression, a rarely discussed detail. During George IV's reign, Prime Minister Lord Liverpool upheld a law and order first policy. Any large gathering of workers was seen as a threat. In 1819, just months after the Peterloo Massacre, the government passed the Six Acts, outlawing political pamphlets, restricting the press, and granting sweeping powers to arrest suspected agitators. Historians still argue, was George IV merely a figurehead, or truly aligned with the government's iron hand? Some sources say he was disengaged, concerned only with his allowance to fund his lavish lifestyle. Others believe he quietly endorsed the crackdown to safeguard royal authority. Close your eyes and imagine the spring of 1822, as workers across northern England went on strike for lower taxes and voting rights. George IV staged a grand tour of Scotland, a bizarre political spectacle. It was the first time a Hanoverian king had visited Edinburgh, and he dressed head to toe in traditional Highland kilt. The crowds cheered, flags waved, but behind the pageantry, millions remained hungry, voiceless, invisible, a detail few remember. When the financial crisis of 1825 erupted, dozens of small banks collapsed, and tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs. George IV issued no statement of comfort. Instead, he requested more funding from Parliament for renovations to Windsor Castle and the Brighton Pavilion. If you feel a lump in your throat, you're not alone, historians. Call it systemic indifference. A soft jab. If there were an award for most unempathetic leader of the year, he'd be a top contender. You shift again, your mind reaching toward those late nights when the House of Commons sat in silence, lit by a few flickering oil lamps. Meanwhile, George IV sat behind closed doors, gasping through gout attacks, holding a list of royal debts with no words of remorse. Historians still debate. Did he understand the growing discontent around his throne? Or did he truly believe that kingship was a divine gift, untouchable by earthly grievances? Some describe him as the last king who saw the crown as an ornament, not a responsibility. Picture George IV signing off on laws that choked civil liberties, his hand trembling from illness, lips pressed tightly together as if to assert was still in control. And yet, ironically, that control was mostly an illusion. One night near the end of his life, as he faded slowly on his sickbed, servants heard George IV mutter a sorrowful line. "They won't remember me for ruling, only for spending." In that moment, all political schemes, all struggles for influence seemed to shrink like a dying spark in a storm. An official fact to remember: under George IV's reign, public education had not yet become a basic right. Most working-class children did not attend school. Literacy was primarily provided through charity schools, run by churches or philanthropic groups. These were cramped, dim classrooms where a single teacher attempted to instruct 100 children crammed together. A rarely mentioned detail: it was during George's regency that the Lancasterian system began to spread. Joseph Lancaster, an ardent educational reformer, proposed the monitorial model in which one teacher trained the best-performing students as monitors who would then teach the others. It was a cost-saving measure. Since public funds seldom prioritized poor children's education, imagine this: a damp room filled with children of all ages, seated on long wooden benches. A trembling child monitor stands with a chalkboard, trying to explain the lesson. The sole teacher, weary-eyed, surveys 100 sweating faces. Historians still debate. Did George IV truly care about education reform? Or was he entirely indifferent? Many records suggest he never proactively advocated for school funding. To him, education was merely a matter for charities, as long as the children didn't become a threat to public order. A little-known fact: while working-class children struggled to sound out syllables on their own, aristocratic boys enjoyed a completely different education, attending elite institutions like Eton and Harrow, or learning from private tutors. These young heirs were taught Latin, Greek, constitutional law, and royal etiquettas, if to remind them that, from childhood, they were already set apart. You shift slightly, drawing a quiet comparison. A 9-year-old weaver's child, calloused hands bruised by loom work, sounding out words in a darkened corner. Meanwhile, across the country, a boy of the same age, in a velvet jacket, pens calligraphy in purple ink, dreaming of one day inheriting an estate. A light joke: if George IV had founded his own school, it would probably be called the Academy of Wine and Jewels. A noteworthy event. Although George IV didn't push for educational reform, his government didn't oppose the rise of the Sunday school movement. This initiative taught poor children to read the Bible and basic literacy each Sunday. By 1830, millions of children had accessed written language through this model. Though the methods were rough and the discipline strict, historians continue to debate the Sunday school's impact. Some view it as a step toward enlightenment. Others criticize it as a tool of religious indoctrination and obedience training. But in an era when reading was still a privilege, Sunday school offered a flicker of light for children living at the bottom of society. Close your eyes one more moment, and imagine a late night in London. The streets empty and silent. In a poor boarding house, a mother lights the single oil lamp, cradles her child, and teaches them to spell their first words like a miracle, pushing back generations of illiteracy. A bitter truth: though education reform was budding, George IV never proposed a law for universal schooling. For him, such matters were far less important than acquiring a new Persian carpet or another gold-threaded ceremonial robe. Exhale gently, letting the story settle within. Perhaps the deepest irony is this. Under the reign of a man who called himself the heir to the light of civilization, millions of children still grew up never touching a pristine book. An official fact to recall. When George IV died on the 26th of June, his brother, the Duke of Clarence, ascended the throne as William IV. He was nicknamed the Sailor King, having served in the Navy for many years, and was notably more modest and approachable than his infamous elder brother. A little-known detail, though William IV was not as extravagantly wasteful as George. He inherited a chaotic treasury and massive debts. The Brighton Pavilion, the symbol of his brother's excess, was considered for auctioning off piece by piece to recover costs. You shift once more, imagining newly appointed officials combing through the palace inventory. They open door after door, counting porcelain vases by the hundreds, brushing dust from worn velvet chairs, flipping through stained ledgers of debt. In a quiet panic, the court scrambled to hide the true scale of the spending, afraid that public outrage would erupt into open revolt. A bitter detail, just weeks after George IV drew his last breath. Newspapers began publishing biting caricatures depicting him with an enormous crown, a bulging belly, and a sack of empty coins. Historians still debate. Was this disrespectful mockery of the dead, or a long-awaited release of public anger after decades of being drained? A gentle joke. If there were an award for most mocked monarch immediately after death, George IV would be unmatched. But take a slow breath, what followed matters more. William IV's reign was short, but it marked a turning point. In 1832, after decades of struggle, Parliament passed the Reform Act, expanding voting rights to the middle class and redrawing constituency boundaries. Historians view it as a watershed moment. The door to democracy cracked open, still narrow, but enough to end the era where a few hundred aristocratic families controlled all of politics. Had George IV lived to see it, he might have raged. As the law shook the very foundation of noble power he so relied upon, picture the day the Reform Act passed. Thousands gathered outside Parliament, erupting in cheers and tears, embracing as, for the first time, they were counted as true citizens. Meanwhile, traditionalists looked back at George IV's legacy as one of grandeur entangled in shame. A rarely mentioned truth. His death lifted the suffocating veil around the monarchy. The press began to write openly about his excesses, affairs, and the false piety the previous court had worked so hard to conceal. The whole nation seemed to exhale, as if freed from a heavy velvet curtain. You pull your knees closer, feeling the blanket's warmth, and wonder, did George IV ever realize that his greatest legacy would not be the gilded palaces, but a costly lesson in the dangers of disconnection between the throne and the people? One winter night in late 1830, as cold wind whipped through London, the last lavish furnishings of the pavilion were loaded onto carts bound for storage. A curious crowd watched, no one mourned. That scene closed a chapter of history, one of a king forgotten faster than any before him. And soon, Britain did not have to wait long. A new monarch ascended, his brother, the Duke of Clarence, known more fondly by both court and public as William IV. Imagine a June morning in 1830, as news spread across cities and countryside alike. The king is dead. Long live King William. Some sighed with relief. Others were curious. Would this new king be different from the indulgent brother so widely scorned? An official event worth remembering. William IV was no stranger to the public. born in 1765. He was over 60 when he took the crown an old king at the start of his reign. But unlike George IV, William was known for his simplicity, affability, and occasional clumsiness, earning him the endearing title, the Sailor King, from later historians. A little-known fact: before becoming king, William served for years in the Royal Navy. He had fought in campaigns in America and the Caribbean, and took pride in having eaten and slept like an ordinary sailor. This story became a kind of legend when he wore the crown of monarch who had once climbed the rigging and eaten porridge with the crew. You shift slightly, drawing the blanket over your shoulders, and picture William IV's coronation. It lacked the extreme opulence of George's sit, did not drain the treasury. Everything was more restrained, more modest, as if to cleanse the bitter aftertaste of the previous reign. Historians still debate, did William IV truly desire the throne? Some records claim he once said to a courtier, "I am too old. The crown holds no charm for me." Others believe his age and time at sea made him calm and steady enough to steer the kingdom through stormy reforms. One charming detail: William IV remains the first and only British monarch to be nicknamed the Sailor King. The public took it as a good omen that here was a ruler who might understand ordinary life better than anyone in the House of Hanover. If you're still awake, exhale slowly, for William IV's reign, though only 7 years long, ushered in deep change. During his time, Britain passed the Reform Act of 1832, a milestone that broadened political representation and laid the foundation for modern democracy. Close your eyes for one more beat, and imagine England in the 1830s still bustling with horse-drawn carriages. Yet the air has changed. The death of George IV closed a weary chapter of extravagance, and William IV, though never hailed as a great reformer, happened to be the one who opened a new door for millions of subjects, longing for hope. If you're still listening, remember this history always moves forward. No matter who once believed themselves the center of eternity, every throne, in the end, is only a temporary seat for a single soul, until another hand lays claim to it. You exhale slowly, letting the night's tale drift like an old ship quietly leaving harbor gently, without anyone realizing how far it has already gone. For after William IV placed his hand upon the crown, Britain entered a new kind of stillness, not yet filled with opulent balls, but not yet truly at peace. Picture the first morning after the coronation. As William awakens in Windsor Castle, sunlight pouring through tall windows, casting a glow on portraits of his father and brother. Perhaps in that moment, he felt the weight of the legacy he'd inherited: massive debts, the tainted image of a wasteful monarchy, and a public's trust slowly eroding. An official fact to remember: unlike George IV, William IV had little taste for lavish rituals. He cut royal expenses, reduced courtly pageantry, and scaled back the face-saving spending typical of previous reigns. Some say he was frugal out of principle. Others joke he was simply too tired to show off. A little-known detail: William IV wasn't as formally educated as other monarchs. In his youth, he spent more time aboard warships than in Latin classrooms. But it was the sailor's life that gave him a blunt, humble temperament and, perhaps, a touch of endearing awkwardness. Imagine a royal dinner. William wears an old naval uniform instead of velvet robes, pours beer for his guests, and chats freely about ocean voyages rather than lofty political theory. To the people, this image was far warmer than that of his indulgent brother. But don't mistake his reign for calm. In truth, Britain was boiling beneath the surface. The industrial middle class was growing rapidly, yet locked out of political power. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham had little to no representation in Parliament, while rotten boroughs, tiny towns, with only a few voter-selected powerful MPs. A critical detail. William IV wasn't a passionate reformer, but he was wise enough to see that delay could lead to rebellion. Under his reign, the electoral reform struggle reached its peak. At last, in 1832, the Reform Act was passed, granting voting rights to hundreds of thousands of middle-class men and abolishing dozens of corrupt boroughs. Historians still debate, did William sign the law because he believed in progress, or simply to avoid losing the throne? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. But to be fair, he was the monarch who witnessed the most pivotal political shift of the 19th century's first half. Close your eyes again and picture the day the Reform Act passed. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, cheering, weeping with joy. Meanwhile, William IV sat quietly in his study, gazing out the window like an old sailor watching waves kiss the shore, aware that his final voyage had carried winds of change. A curious fact: unlike George IV, William IV had few public scandals, but his family life was complicated. He had many illegitimate children from his naval youth, yet no legitimate heir with Queen Adelaide. So when he died in 1837, the crown passed not to a son, but to a young Nisa girl just 18. Unfamiliar with court life, take a slow breath and let your imagination drift to William IV's final moments. On June 20, 1837, he quietly drew his last breath at Windsor Castle, closing a reign that, though brief, brought more change than many ever expected. On a summer morning, royal flags hung at half-mast, and news spread across the empire. Victoria, daughter of the Duke of Kent, had become queen. This was the Victoria, the future longest reigning monarch in British history, destined to lead the nation into a glorious new era. Exhale now, letting peace settle over you. For tonight, we've sailed through 3. Reigns a king of decadence lost in luxury, a sailor king of plainness and reluctant change, and the shadow of a young girl about to carve her own legend. Take one more slow breath, letting the story slip through the quiet crevices of your mind, as though you're standing within a tall, spiral staircase. Each step a faded century, and as William IV's final footsteps dissolve into silence, the next step begins to glow with dawn carrying the name of a young girl who had no idea her life was about to transform an empire. Close your eyes gently and picture the morning of the 20th of June. 1837. The first light warms the rooftops of London. The Thames glistens under the rising sun. Inside Kensington Palace, a petite 18-year-old girl with chestnut hair sleeps peacefully in her private room. The door swings open, royal courtiers enter. Fate solemn. They bring the final message of a fading reign. As the young girl opens her eyes, still too dazed to speak, they bow deeply and declare, "Your Majesty." From that moment, Victoria was no longer a forgotten princess in one of Hanover's many branches. She became Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, heir to a throne once turned into a spectacle of extravagance by George IV, and then quietly steadied by William IV's modest hands. An official fact to remember: Victoria was the daughter of the Duke of Kent, another of George IV's brothers. Because William IV had no legitimate children, the crown passed to her, marking the beginning of the Victorian era, which would last for 63 years. The longest reign in British history at that time. A little-known truth: the night before William IV's death, many at court whispered doubts, calling the young princess too delicate, too dreamy, unfit to hold power. But none could foresee that her very softness would become her strength. Picture her coronation in 1838. Victoria wore a long, sweeping robe, gloved hands trembling slightly, lips pressed together in determination. Westminster Abbey echoed with solemn music as the crown touched her brown hair. The crowd held its breath and then erupted. They had grown weary of aging, scandal-ridden kings. They longed for something new, a soft jest. If George IV could see it from heaven, he might shake his head and mutter, "That throne should have gone to me one more time." Historians still debate. Did the legacies of George IV and William IV truly influence Victoria's reign? Many believe they did, that George's flamboyant failures and William's awkward restraint taught her a crucial lesson. Power requires discipline and restraint, not just pageantry. Exhale gently, letting your mind drift to those early Victorian days. Across Britain, children still labored in textile mills. Workers demanded rights, and aristocrats continued their lavish lives. But the air felt subtly different. There was a whisper of promise that this new era might not mirror the old. A fascinating detail: Victoria immediately chose to live differently from her predecessors. She limited royal spending, reduced pointless festivities, and showed greater concern for social welfare than any Hanover monarch before her. Many came to call her the Queen of Duty, a stark contrast to the King of Excess. Close your eyes once more, and imagine the very throne that once groaned beneath George IV's bloated splendor, now supporting a slender, soft-spoken girl. Perhaps it, too, sighed in. Relief finally returned to someone simpler in spirit. On an early Victorian evening, oil lamps glowed in the ancient halls. People say she would often sit writing in her diary for hours, recording every flicker of feeling, each fear and resolve, vowing that history would never remember her as a puppet on a golden seat. Take one last slow breath, because now we've crossed into a new age, the age of steam engines, of expanding empire, of profound social change. And the stories of George IV and William IV are no longer just theirs. They are warnings etched in gold and dust, that all power, if used merely for self-indulgence, will eventually crumble. If you're still awake, remind yourself history is ever changing its cast. People arrive, step across the stage, bow, and fade, and every throne, whether gilded or veiled in velvet, is ultimately just a chair awaiting someone. A new heart, a new hope. As you close your eyes tonight, let the whispers of history become a lullaby, reminding you that you live in an age where a person's worth is no longer tied to a crown. And that, truly, is the most beautiful legacy the past has left us. Now, as your room falls silent, the lights soften, and the sounds of the outside world begin to dissolve, I want you to know, you, too, are a part of this great current of time. No crown is needed. No throne is required. You are already writing a story, your own story of a soul that listens, that feels deeply, and that recognizes the quiet worth of a peaceful night. Take a long, slow breath. Let your shoulders soften, and allow your eyelids to gently close. Let the images of cold palaces, the sighs of monarchs, and the quiet promises of tomorrow's sunrise slip away. Tonight, you are no longer a witness to anyone else's past. You are simply, and perfectly, yourself, a heart deserving of peace. If you can still hear my voice, tell yourself that everything will be all right. Today's worries will fade like early morning mist. The weariness, the unspoken doubts, to the weight you haven't yet put down, let them rest for now. Because no one on this earth is strong every moment. Even the most powerful king was, in the end, just a fragile soul longing to be loved. Take one final deep breath before sleep finds you. And thank yourself for walking bravely through this day. You've done enough. You are enough. You deserve gentleness, serenity, and a long, undisturbed night. And as you drift off, imagine a window cracked open to the vast, quiet sky. There, a soft wind passes by, whispering that tomorrow, yes, tomorrow will begin again. Just a little lighter than today. Sleep well. May your heart find its calm. May your dreams be filled with sweetness.